AITA for refusing to take responsibility for my brother's life and kids. I grew up knowing there was favoritism in my family. Although I spent years trying to ignore it, for as long as I can remember, my parents always doted on my younger brother, justifying every mistake he made, rescuing him from every bad decision, while I was expected to be independent. I never knew what it was like to have their unconditional support. If I needed something, the answer was always, "You're strong. You can handle it." But when my brother got into trouble, somehow, they always found a way to help him. I learned to fend for myself. I worked from high school, saved every penny, and worked my way through college without asking them for anything. With scholarships, student loans, and part-time jobs, I graduated with a degree that allowed me to get a stable, well-paying job. I thought that would finally make my parents proud of me, but their enthusiasm for my success was minimal. A simple "that's good" was all I got. Meanwhile, my brother lived in a completely different world. He married young, his high school sweetheart, but the marriage barely lasted 2 years. After his divorce, he started making impulsive decisions, changing jobs constantly, living off loans and my parents' financial help. It wasn't long before he married again and had 2 more children, but history repeated itself. Another divorce, more debt, more problems. After his 3rd failed attempt at a stable relationship, he already had 5 children with different partners and no steady income. My parents, instead of holding him accountable, protected him. "He's going through a rough patch," they said. "He just needs stability." Every time he got into trouble, they were there to pay the overdue rent, cover school expenses, or even help his latest partner with her bills. Meanwhile, I worked tirelessly, building my own life without expecting anything from them. For years, I distanced myself from all that chaos. It's not that I didn't love my brother, but I refused to be part of the cycle of rescues and excuses that my parents fueled. I saw it as an endless pattern. He made mistakes, my parents intervened, he never faced the consequences, and the story repeated itself. I was busy with my work, my own plans, trying to establish a life that didn't revolve around family drama. But then, something changed. My parents started treating me differently. They showed more interest in my life. They invited me to dinner more often, sent me messages asking how I was doing. I couldn't help but feel confused. After so many years of indifference, suddenly, they seemed concerned about me. At first, I wanted to believe it was genuine, that maybe, finally, they were seeing my effort and respecting the life I had built without their help. The first few months of this new attitude were strange, but welcome. I felt, for the first time, included in the family dynamic. My parents spoke admiringly of my work, mentioned how stable my life was, how much I had achieved. They asked about my future plans, even suggested I spend more time with them. I thought that, after all this time, maybe they had realized they hadn't been fair to me. I wanted to believe their attitude had truly changed. However, it didn't take long for me to discover the real reason behind their sudden interest. It was during a dinner at their house, after weeks of this new treatment, when they dropped the bomb. Between conversation and laughter, the topic slowly shifted to my brother. They started talking about how difficult it was for him to raise 5 children without financial stability, how each of his attempts to improve his situation ended in failure. They said they had done everything possible to help him, but they could no longer continue supporting his life. At first, I didn't understand where the conversation was going, but then they said it clearly. They expected me to take responsibility for my brother and his children. They wanted me to buy a large house where he and the kids could live comfortably because his current apartment was too small and the rent was too high. They wanted me to set up educational funds for the children because I was the only one with the means to do so. They also suggested that, with my good salary, I could give a monthly allowance to my brother and the children, ensuring they wouldn't lack anything. I was in shock. They weren't asking for a little occasional help. They were demanding that I become the family's primary provider, the economic pillar that would sustain the lives of my brother and the children he had irresponsibly brought into the world. All their recent affection and apparent recognition of me was nothing more than a strategy to soften me up before dropping their request. When I said I couldn't do something like that, the transformation was instantaneous. The warm tone disappeared. My mother started crying, accusing me of abandoning the family when they needed me most. My father looked at me with disappointment and called me selfish. Suddenly, I was no longer the successful son they were proud of. Now I was the heartless one, the one who was leaving his brother and nephews in ruin. Dinner ended in shouting and a tension I had never felt in that house. I left there with a mixture of anger and disbelief. All this time I had been believing that my parents finally saw me for who I was, when in reality they only saw me as a solution to their problems. I left that house feeling like a stranger. I couldn't believe what had just happened. All the supposed reconciliation, the family dinners, the messages of concern, it had all been a trap. They didn't care about my effort or my achievements. They only cared about what I could do for my brother and his children. I drove back to my apartment with a clouded mind, trying to process the conversation. For years I had tried not to resent the difference in how they treated me. But in that moment, everything became unbearably clear. I wasn't their independent and successful son they were finally learning to value. To them, I was a resource, a walking bank account. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. The next day, the messages started arriving. First, it was my mother. "Son, I know last night was difficult, but please think about your brother and your nephews. Family always helps each other." I ignored the message. I didn't want to deal with it so soon. Then my father. "We can't understand how you can be so cold to your own blood. We've done so much for you, and now you turn your back on us when we need you most." My anger grew with every word. So much for me. As if they had supported me in anything. As if I hadn't spent my life working twice as hard to get ahead without asking them for anything. But the real blow came a few hours later, when my brother decided to intervene. "I don't understand why you're doing this. I'm not asking you to give me $1 million. I just need some help to get by. It's not my fault things went wrong for me. But you were lucky in life. Can't you really share a little with your family?" That last phrase was the one that left me speechless. Lucky? Did he really believe that what I had was a matter of luck? I had worked every minute of my life to achieve what I had. I didn't have the luxury of making mistakes and having my parents there to fix everything. I didn't have a safety net. Every goal I reached was because I worked myself to exhaustion to achieve it. I didn't respond. There was no point. But the messages didn't stop. Every few hours, a new one. My parents insisting that I had an obligation to help, my brother playing the victim and throwing passive-aggressive hints. And then, worst of all, my nephew started writing to me. The first to message me was the oldest, a 14-year-old. "Uncle, Mom says you don't love us anymore because we're a burden to you. Is it true?" I stared at the screen, feeling frustration mixed with sadness. My brother was using them as a shield, manipulating me to feel guilty, as if I were a monster for not wanting to give him everything he asked for. After that, more messages arrived. Some were short and sad. "Uncle, are you really going to leave us on the street? Dad says if you don't help us, he doesn't know what will happen to us." Others were directly hurtful. "You're selfish. How can you have so much money and not share it?" I couldn't take it anymore. I blocked their numbers. Not because I didn't care about my nephews, but because I knew that everything they said came directly from my brother. I wasn't going to play his game. But that didn't mean the problems ended. When my family realized I wasn't responding, the situation escalated ridiculously. They started calling me at work. The first day, my mother tried to call me at the office reception, saying it was a family emergency. Fortunately, my assistant knew how to handle it and didn't put the call through. Then, my father tried to contact me through a colleague on LinkedIn, sending a message about how he was worried about me and needed to talk to me urgently. It was humiliating. They were harassing me, trying to pressure me by any means possible. The last straw came when my boss called me into his office. We received a message on the company's general line. It was a woman, I think your mother, saying there was a family problem and they needed you to contact them immediately. I was speechless. Not only were they crossing all boundaries, but now they were involving my job in this. I apologized to my boss and briefly explained the situation. Luckily, he understood perfectly and told me he would block any further calls of that kind. I left the office feeling suffocated. I couldn't understand how we had reached this point. My own family was harassing me as if I were a criminal, just for refusing to give them my money. I thought about going to talk to them face to face, putting an end to everything once and for all. But I knew it wouldn't work. They weren't people you could reason with. They would always find a way to make me look like the bad guy. So I decided something. I was going to cut contact with them completely. I didn't take it lightly. I spent that night thinking about everything it meant. Maybe it meant losing my family forever. But did I ever really have a family that truly valued me? The next day, I changed my phone number. I deleted my parents and my brother from all my social media. I called my building's security department and asked them not to allow anyone who wasn't on my guest list to enter. I decided that if my family only wanted me in their lives as an ATM, then they didn't want me at all. It had been a week since I cut off all contact with my family. I felt at peace for the first time in a long time. Although guilt still tried to creep in, I repeated to myself, over and over again, that it wasn't my responsibility to support my brother's life or pay the consequences of his decisions. I had changed my number, blocked everyone on social media, and taken steps to prevent them from showing up at my work. But I underestimated how far they would go. It was a Saturday morning. I was enjoying my coffee when the building intercom rang. "Someone is at the reception desk asking to see you. Says it's an urgent family matter." The security guard informed me. I immediately knew who it was, my mother. I couldn't believe it. She had traveled all the way here just to continue with this game. I looked out the window, and sure enough, there she was at the entrance, impeccably dressed, with a martyr's face, and carrying a bag containing something that was surely an excuse to make me open the door. "Tell her I'm not available," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. I knew what was coming. The guard gave her the message, and as if it were a rehearsed script, my mother began to cry at the building entrance, saying she didn't understand why I was treating her like this. Some residents looked at her with discomfort, others with curiosity. I only felt anger. I knew it was a tactic, that she was manipulating the situation to make me look like the villain. After a few minutes, she gave up and left. But it wasn't the end. The next person to show up was my brother. A couple of days later, I found him waiting for me in my building's parking lot. "Are you seriously going to do this?" he said, arms crossed. "To your own family?" I got into my car and tried to ignore him, but he planted himself in front of the door before I could close it. "I just want to talk," he said, but his tone wasn't that of someone seeking reconciliation. He sounded resentful, annoyed. I took a deep breath and decided to give him 2 minutes. "Just 2. Tell me what you want and leave," I said, crossing my arms. "What I want," he laughed incredulously. "I want to understand how the hell you can sleep at night knowing you're leaving us in ruin." I rolled my eyes. I knew this was going to happen. "I'm not leaving anyone in ruin," I said patiently. "I'm just not going to continue financing your mistakes." My brother snorted. "Mistakes? I have 5 kids. I can't just leave them with nothing. Maybe you should have thought about that before having 5 children without being able to support them," I blurted out without a filter. His face tightened. For a second, I thought he was going to hit me, but instead, he changed tactics. "You know Mom and Dad are devastated, right? They can barely sleep. Mom won't stop crying. She says she doesn't understand what she did wrong with you." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the comment. What she did wrong with me? I don't know. Maybe raising me in a home where I was never a priority, I replied, staring at him. "Or making you her sole focus while I was taught that I was on my own." He looked away but quickly regained his aggressive attitude. "We're just asking you to help, not to support us for life. It's the least you can do for the family." "The least?" I repeated incredulously. "Do you have any idea of everything I've achieved without their help? How much I've worked to be where I am, while you went from failure to failure knowing you would always have Mom and Dad to bail you out? That's not fair." He snapped, his face red with anger. "It's not my fault that life treated me this way." And there it was again, the same excuse. Poor me, it's not my fault. I was fed up. It's not life, it's you. You made every decision that led you to this, and I'm not going to rescue you just because Mom and Dad can't do it anymore." My brother was silent for a few seconds, breathing heavily. Then, his expression changed again, but this time it was more menacing. "So that's it, huh?" he said in a low voice. "Fine, but just so you know, when you're alone and well off, when nobody cares about you because you only thought of yourself, don't come looking for me." I stared at him, unblinking. "Don't worry," I said calmly. "I never will." Without saying more, I got into my car and closed the door. I didn't see him again after that. But the story wasn't over yet. A couple of weeks later, when I thought things had finally calmed down, I received an unexpected call. It was my grandfather, and what he told me changed everything. When I saw my grandfather's number on my phone screen, I hesitated to answer. He never called. Not because we didn't have a good relationship, but because he had always been a man of few words, someone who stayed out of family drama. I took a deep breath and answered. "Hi, Grandpa." "Son." His voice sounded firm, but more serious than usual. "We need to talk." There was a long silence before he dropped the bomb. Your parents have been saying things about you to the family, and I want you to know that nobody believes them anymore. I was in shock. I wasn't surprised that my parents were spreading lies about me, but that my grandfather called me to tell me was another story. What are they saying now? I asked, bracing myself for the worst. My grandfather sighed. That you abandoned them, that you've become arrogant with your money, and that you despise your own blood. They say you refuse to help your brother because you've always been jealous of him. I closed my eyes and gritted my teeth. Jealous? After all I had lived through, after being ignored and cast aside throughout my childhood and youth, now it turned out that I was the jealous one. They're also saying that you took advantage of them, my grandfather continued. That you took money from them for years, and that now that you're doing well you treat them as if they don't exist. That comment made me laugh, but not with happiness, but with disbelief. Really? Money? I said ironically. They never gave me anything, Grandpa. Never. Not for college, not for my expenses, not for anything. I know, he said, his tone more serious. And that's why I'm calling, because it turns out my grandfather had just discovered something that had left him furious. Listen carefully, son, he said with the seriousness of someone who was about to reveal something important. Did you know that for years your grandmother and I gave your parents money to help you with your studies? My heart stopped. What? My voice came out lower than I expected. We sent them money every year, he continued. It wasn't a ridiculous amount, but it was enough so you wouldn't have to work so much while you were studying. We thought they were using it for you. My mind began to connect the dots. My parents never helped me with my studies. They never offered to pay for a single book, a single tuition fee, a single expense. But now my grandfather was telling me that, for years, they had been receiving money under the pretense of helping me. Grandpa, my voice cracked a little because anger was starting to grow in my chest. How much money are we talking about? There was an uncomfortable silence. More than $50,000. $50,000. While I worked late nights cleaning tables, while I killed myself at part-time jobs to pay every penny of my education, my parents had been receiving money from me, and they had spent it on something else. I can't believe it, I murmured. Your grandmother is furious. We only found out a few days ago when we were talking to your mother, and she let it slip without thinking. She told us they used it on more urgent things. More urgent things? I looked around my apartment, my own life built with my effort, and I knew exactly where that money had gone. They used it on my brother, didn't they? I asked bitterly. My grandfather was slow to answer, but when he did, his voice was full of disappointment. Yes. I sank into the sofa, feeling a weight on my chest that I hadn't felt in years. All my life, I had believed that they simply didn't have money for me, that I had been born into a family where support was only for one of the children and not the other. But now I knew the truth. They did have the money. They just decided to give it to my brother. I don't know what to say, I admitted, running a hand over my face. You don't have to say anything, my grandfather replied. I just want you to know that this is over. What do you mean? Your grandmother and I are setting things straight. We've already spoken to our lawyer, and I assure you your parents won't receive another penny from us. That left me speechless. My grandparents had always been the type to keep the peace, to avoid getting involved in family conflicts. But this had crossed a line that not even they could ignore. We're not doing this out of revenge, my grandfather added. But we're tired of seeing how they've taken advantage of the family for years. It's over. I leaned back on the sofa and let out a long sigh. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone in the family had my back. But then, my grandfather said something else. I advise you to be vigilant. Your mother isn't going to accept this easily. What do you mean? They don't see what they did as wrong. In their minds, you're the ungrateful one. And when they realize they have no more financial support, they're going to look for another way to get it. I didn't know what to answer, but deep down I knew he was right. What I didn't know was how far they were willing to go. Because, 2 days later, I received a certified letter. My parents were suing me. When I saw the envelope with my name and the words, legal notification, I knew this wasn't going to be good. My parents were suing me? For a moment, I thought it was a joke. They couldn't be that desperate. But when I opened the envelope and read the documents, I felt a chill run down my spine. They were suing me for failure to provide family support. The lawsuit alleged that, as a son, I had a moral and economic obligation to help my parents and my brother in times of need. Basically, they were trying to use a distorted version of the law to force me to pay for them. It was ridiculous, but it was also terrifying. I knew that in some states in the United States, there are filial responsibility laws where, in extreme cases, children can be forced to financially support their parents if they are indigent. But my parents weren't indigent. They weren't on the street. They had simply become accustomed to living off the generosity of others, and now that the tap had been turned off, they wanted to force me to be their new source of income. I called a lawyer immediately. I wanted to make sure this had no legal basis. They scheduled a consultation for me, and I spent the night reviewing every line of the lawsuit. The worst part was seeing what they wrote about me. My parents claimed they had always supported me financially, and that now that I was in a better financial position, I was turning my back on them. They said that investing in me had been a sacrifice, and that now that I was successful, the least I could do was pay them back for what they spent on me and the family. Investing in me? The cynicism left me speechless. They had never given me a penny. Everything I had earned through hard work. But in their minds, I owed them something just for existing. The most absurd part was that the lawsuit also mentioned my brother and his children. They said that, as an uncle, I had a responsibility to ensure that my nephews had a stable life. Since when was it my job to be the father of my brother's children? The next day, I met with the lawyer. I gave him the papers and waited for him to review them. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "Let me guess," he said. "Your parents never gave you money for anything." "Exactly. And now that I'm successful, they want me to take care of them and my brother." I nodded, still unable to believe this was happening. The lawyer put the papers on the table and crossed his arms. "Well, I have good news and bad news. Give me the bad news first." The bad news is that, technically, the lawsuit isn't completely absurd. There are some states that have laws allowing these types of claims if the parents can prove they are in a desperate situation. I felt a knot in my stomach. But he continued, "The good news is that your parents don't have a snowball's chance in hell of winning this. For a court to even consider the lawsuit, they would have to prove that you were financially dependent on them at some point recently. And, from what you tell me, not only did they not help you, but they even used money that wasn't theirs to benefit your brother." "Exactly. So this is going nowhere," he said confidently. "But let me warn you, this isn't about money. This is about control." That phrase hit me like a brick. Of course, this had never been just about money. It was about the fact that I had distanced myself, that I had broken the cycle, that I refused to be the provider for a family that had never given me anything. My parents weren't suing because they really believed they could win. They were doing it to show that they could still control me, to make me feel trapped. "What if I ignore them?" I asked. The lawyer smiled. "Nothing. You can formally respond with a motion to dismiss the case. This will never go to trial anyway. A judge will laugh them out of court. And if they continue to press, that depends on you," he said. "You can counter with a harassment complaint and present evidence that they have been interfering in your personal and professional life. If they continue to bother you after the lawsuit is dismissed, you could even get a restraining order." A restraining order against my own parents? I never thought it would come to that. But, at the same time, I knew I couldn't continue to allow them to manipulate me. "Let's do it," I said without hesitation. That same week, we filed the motion to dismiss the lawsuit. But what I didn't expect was my parents' reaction. Because, instead of accepting defeat with some dignity, they decided to do something even worse. They went directly to the media. I thought the worst they could do was sue me. I thought that, with the help of my lawyer, I could handle this, and that, eventually, my parents would accept defeat. But I had no idea how far they were willing to go. It all started when a friend sent me a message with a link to an article, "Successful Son Abandons Family in Ruin. Desperate Parents Plead for Help." I felt a chill reading the headline. I clicked on the link, and what I found was a completely manipulated version of the story. According to the article, I was an arrogant millionaire who had forgotten where I came from. They painted my parents as an elderly couple who had given everything for their children, only to be cruelly ignored by one of them. But the worst wasn't what they said about me. The worst was that the article talked about my work and personal life with precise details. They mentioned the city I lived in, what kind of work I did, and even a distorted version of my relationship with my brother. According to the article, he was a hard-working father who had fallen on hard times, and I simply refused to help him because I had always been jealous of him. That word again. My blood boiled. All the information they used came from my parents. And the worst is that it wasn't just an isolated article. It began to appear on several local news sites, on some Facebook forums in the city. The story was going viral. There were comments from strangers calling me the worst son in the world, a monster, a disgrace. Then came the messages. At first, they were comments on my social media, which were still private. But that didn't stop people from tagging me on LinkedIn and professional forums. How can you leave your parents on the street? You're trash. I hope you lose everything you have. Your family raised you, and now you abandon them. You selfish jerk. People were commenting on my life without knowing the truth. But the final straw was when my company received an anonymous email asking for me to be fired. Yes, someone had sent a message to my boss saying that I was a man without ethics, that I abandoned my family, and that my behavior was incompatible with the company's values. I knew immediately that it had been my mother or my father. They knew they couldn't force me to give them money, so they were trying to ruin me. They called me from human resources, and I had to explain what was happening. Luckily, my company wasn't manipulated. They knew that sensationalist news was often full of lies. But this wasn't just a family problem anymore. This was public harassment. And I decided it was time to put an end to it once and for all. I took legal action. My lawyer filed a cease and desist order against my parents and against the news outlet that published the story without verifying it. We also started working on a defamation lawsuit. I knew my parents would probably never pay a penny, but I wasn't going to let them get away with it without consequences. My grandfather called again. "Son," he said in a heavy voice, "your mother and father have made the worst mistake of their lives." My grandfather and grandmother, after seeing what they did, made a decision. They disinherited them. Not only that, they evicted them from the house they were living in. My grandparents owned the property where my parents had been living for years without paying a single penny. They always assumed that someday it would be left to them. But after seeing how they publicly attacked me, they decided they didn't deserve anything. "We gave them 30 days to leave," my grandfather said harshly. "And this time we're not going to change our minds." It was incredible. My parents had spent years manipulating the family, taking advantage of my grandparents' generosity. But as soon as they ran out of their source of money, they revealed their true selves. And now they were paying the price. My parents panicked. They tried to get my uncles and other relatives to intercede for them, but no one wanted to get involved after what they had done. They were completely alone. My mother tried to call me several times, but I blocked her. There was nothing left to say. My brother also tried to negotiate with me. "If you make the grandparents change their minds, we can forget all this," he wrote in a message. I ignored him. There was no turning back. The last I heard of my parents, they were looking for a place to live with the little money they had left. My brother was still trying to convince someone to help him financially. But after so much drama, even his own ex-partners were forcing him to take responsibility. For the first time in my life, I felt like it wasn't my problem anymore. But the most unexpected thing was what happened with my nephews. The oldest, the one who had sent me messages at the beginning, wrote to me again. "Uncle, now I understand what you did. Sorry for what we said before. My brother had put his children in the middle of everything. But, in the end, they were just victims of his irresponsibility." I replied telling him that he had nothing to apologize for. It wasn't the children's fault that their father was like that. Even my grandfather intervened and began to organize an education fund for them, making sure that their father couldn't touch a penny. For the first time, I had the feeling that something good could come out of all this. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.